A book?
That's right. When I was your age, television was called books, and this is a special book. It was a book my father used to read to me when I was sick, and I used to read it to your father. And today, I'm gonna read it to you.
Has it got any sports in it?
Are you kidding? Fencing, fighting, torture, revenge, giants, monsters, chases, escapes, true love, miracles.
It doesn't sound too bad. I'll try to stay awake.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Very nice of you. Your vote of confidence is overwhelming.
The Princess Bride.
You're listening to Writing Roots, brought to you by Aspen House Publishing.
Welcome to Writing Roots. I'm Lee Hull.
And I'm Lee Esses.
I'm so excited for discussing this movie because it's so good.
It truly has stood the test of time.
Princess Bride was released in 1987, and it is a fantastic adventure romance with a little bit of ties to the modern world. It was based off of a book, and that kind of storyline was incorporated into the movie.
There are a lot of fantastic characters in this. I heard someone once say that this story within the story felt like a D&D campaign. And that's because each of these characters individually are so potent and so powerful, and they're some of our favorite characters throughout history.
The names of these characters really tell a lot about who they are and what role they have in the story. The inner story, you have names like Buttercup. That is a very floral, obviously, name that is representative of the beauty of that character. And then you have names like the Man in Black, also known as Dread Pirate Roberts, also known as Wesley.
All of these very colorful names that stand out on the page. And if you compare that to the outer story, those names are very generic. You literally have the grandfather, the grandson. In the opposite way that the inner characters are so potent, the outer characters are very generic without being boring.
Yeah, you can definitely tell they still have personality. They still have some depth to them. There is some hints at character, backstory, all of that there. But they are just generic enough that we can picture ourselves as being that grandson, as being that grandfather. Now, the main characters and secondary characters, this is a little interesting because I think technically the main character is the grandson.
But he's almost not in the movie at all.
But he has a story arc of some kind to him. He grows to learn to love the story. He grows to learn to love the interest in all of that.
Other characters have some element of character arc, but they don't change a whole lot. Buttercup didn't go through any level of self-discovery. The Dread Pirate was Wesley, was the Man in Black. And this reveal is a fascinating change of how we see the character, but the character is still pretty much the character. The only one that really has this plot arc from beginning to end, I would say, is Inigo.
Yeah, because he has his revenge arc, which is successful, which I actually really enjoy having.
I actually think that the strongest element as far as character design for these characters and for the story would be the dialogue. There's so many easy ways to quote this movie, and it's just very comfortable. Everything that comes out of the characters' mouths is very in character and potent and just gorgeously done.
And even the small character roles have very iconic ways of speaking that really represent them and who they are. There's not a lot of crossover in word choice and speech pattern or anything like that.
If you look at the end of our opener today, you have the grandson going, "I'll try to stay awake." Very natural, very human, and still conveying quite a bit about the character. Whereas Grandpa responds with, "Your vote of confidence is overwhelming," which is a very poetic way of saying, "Oh, gee, thanks." And that tells us, even in these small interactions, a lot about the characters and a lot of skill in the writing of this story.
And then in the inner world, you have classic word choice to denote class. You have Fezzik versus Vicini, where Fezzik is so excited that he can come up with simple rhymes. Anybody want a peanut? And something else that happens a lot in the inner story and outer story is the exposition through dialogue.
When we first meet Fezzik and Inigo and Vicini goes to each of them and goes, here's your backstory. Do you want to go back to where you were unemployed in Greenland? And here's what we're doing. Laid out, we're leaving this badge on the horse so that we can start a war. Like, they are not shy about info dumping. But I think this is a credit to the actor that it was so well delivered that we don't realize they're info dumping.
You have a lot of these kinds of moments, but between the writing and then, of course, the acting, it all feels very natural to the story, which is a good representation for your writing, that you can have exposition. You can have those moments where a character is explaining and releasing all of that information through dialogue, so long as you make it interesting and compelling enough that we don't notice that it's happening.
And fast. Don't spend a lot of time on it. If you're giving me a page and a half of backstory, it is very difficult to deliver it in a compelling way.
Yeah. Now, for the plot structure, this is a very interesting one because it is very clearly a story within a story. And we very quickly get into the, kid is homesick, grandfather comes over to read him a story, and then we see the story as the grandfather reads it to him.
I also think that this is a great example of ensemble storytelling, where you are introduced to a whole bunch of characters fairly quickly, and then it's how they interact that moves the plot along, more than the hero and the secondary characters. It almost feels like everyone is a secondary character, but they're all really close to primary characters. I normally point people toward crime dramas and TV shows for ensemble storytelling because they manage to highlight different characters at different times depending on what that story needs. Seeing ensemble storytelling in a book or a movie is very different because of the plot structure, and they do it really well here.
Now for the timeline, in this particular movie, that's a difficult thing to really pin down because there are a couple of different inciting actions. The outer story, you have the grandfather coming over with the book, which happens right away. And then another inciting action is kind of Wesley going off to become a pirate because without him leaving, then she would not have been available for the prince to choose. And then you have Humperdinck, who announces the marriage to Buttercup at around 6 minutes in, which is kind of the final inciting incident. But all of these things happen very quickly. Like we said, that last one happens at 6 minutes into the movie.
So the inciting incident in this particular story kind of gets broken up depending on whose character you're following when.
Yeah, and whether you're in that inner story or outer story or what role of this ensemble that you are playing. So it's a really difficult thing to pull off in your own story, but if you do it quickly enough like they did in The Princess Bride, it can work.
When we look at the world building in this is a great example of not shying away from cliché and actually using cliché to your advantage. There is a prince in a kingdom. There is a rival kingdom. He is getting married to a princess. All of these things are super cliché and generic. And that's why they work. We don't need to have the whole world backstory of how Florin and Gilder are at odds and blah, 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 blah. Because we already have this type of a mindset, we can go into it focusing on what's really important because the cliche is being used well in this case.
And then as they went through the story, they released relevant information as it was needed. And they didn't spend a lot of time on it. So you have characters talking about the war between Florin and Gilder, and we get that idea. We get a lot of backstory given through dialogue. One of my favorites is the fire swamp and introducing the 3 dangers of the fire swamp. Everybody knows them. And now we know how to avoid 2 of them.
I was especially fascinated at how they built the map because the map was strictly defined by the dangers in the way. We know there are shrieking eels next to the Cliffs of Insanity, next to the spaces that are the 3 challenges before he defeats Vicini, next to the fire swamps. All of these dangers help us build this map in our imagination. So unveiling the map based on what's our next challenge is a great way to make the world feel in-depth and real and really threaten the characters with your world building more than just your villains.
The overall technique of storytelling in The Princess Bride I really like it. That story within a story element where we get this connection because we see it's a story in a story, we can forgive a lot of the inconsistencies that we would otherwise be like, what?
We can also forgive the cliche because it's the person who wrote this actual book and not the person who's telling the story. Playing into that cliche helps us feel like it's a story within a story and not necessarily its own movie in its own right.
The kinds of stories that you can really take this information and use it for is anyone who feels like their story is cliche. You can look at this and go, it doesn't matter if it's cliche. People can still love it. There are so many cliches in The Princess Bride, and people are still discovering it and loving it today, despite all of that. Great writing is what makes it still stand out.
Another thing to study this movie for would be that framing device, and especially how they connect to their audience. So the grandfather-grandson, they often interrupt the inner story to tell us things that the characters are wondering, and probably us as an audience are wondering. The interruption of Buttercup doesn't get eaten here at the Shrieking Eels. I'm telling you because you're looking scared. These kinds of excerpts that connect with your audience, this is a great example of how to do that in a story within a story type format. Next up, we have a movie that I personally am not going to give a 10 out of 10. We've had rave reviews of these first couple, and I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of hate mail. We are talking next episode about Kiki's Delivery Service.
And until we meet up again to discuss that movie,
Right selfishly.
If you have a question or comment for our hosts or a topic you'd like us to cover, send us an email at writingroots@aspenhousepublishing.com or find us on Facebook by searching for Aspen House Publishing.